Every era has its new diseases. AIDS is not the first and won't be the last. Our history and destiny are shaped by our diseases. The origins of our ills are complex, mysterious, and surprising. And they must be understood if we are to avoid always being plagued.
Hi there, Thursday afternoon with Gary Murphy, and it must be summertime in Baltimore because, whew, it's hot out there. Baltimore weather, hot and humid this afternoon.
This is Baltimore on the US East Coast in the 1990s. A new disease is lurking amongst these houses. It's waiting to burst across America. It isn't AIDS, but it has been seen before. It was during war when a terrifying new illness appeared. The Korean War in 1951.
Strong, healthy young people would suddenly develop a blinding headache behind the eyes and great thirst and a great amount of muscle aches and pains and become very weak.
They suddenly developed fever, unexplained bleeding, and often died of shock or kidney failure.
They were dying during transport to Seoul and large hospitals. Many of them had what appeared to be a surgical acute abdomen, and they were operated on, and all of those died. It was clearly an infectious disorder. People were catching it who had all simultaneously been in one small location in close contact with recently dug or cleared bush or forest.
The mystery was in fact caused by war. And as so often in history, we created a new disease for ourselves. This film is about our vulnerability to new diseases, in part because we ignore where they really come from.
Some of the field commanders thought, well, if there's something out there in the brush that is injuring my troops, I'll burn it off. It was a completely unknown disease in that area, and therefore every possibility as to its origin had to be considered, including germ warfare.
Under conditions of ecological change, new diseases which were formerly buried in the environment may suddenly acquire whole new opportunities to infect new people and suddenly come to attention to cause a major outbreak of a new disease.
They called the new disease Korean hemorrhagic fever. And with thousands of troops out of action, the Americans threw millions of dollars into finding the cause. But despite their money and manpower, the US researchers failed. It was 25 years later when a Korean team found it, near the Hantan River, the site of some of the war's worst fighting. It was an infection, and the Korean scientists named the virus Hantan, after the river.
In 1976, we found the Hantan virus in this area. So this is very historical place for this disease.
The vital clue had come from Professor Lee's lab assistant.
머리가 아프기 시작해가지고요. 머리가 그냥 막 짜겨지는 것 같이 그렇게 하고, 그때 그냥 몸에 열이 나고, 그래갖고 배가 그냥 아파서 여기 배가. 그래야 배가 아파서 그냥 죽을 뻔해가지고 그러고 나니 허리 아프지 그냥 설사 쫙 자가지 죽다 못해 그저 살아난 거죠.
What Mr. Kim had was Korean hemorrhagic fever, and that solved the mystery. The infection had come from the mice he'd trapped by the river.
If you have close contact with mice or rat, you get the high chance of the infection.
The rodent's excreta dries and is inhaled into the body as contaminated dust. That's how easily you can catch it. So is it possible that our own actions could turn Korean hemorrhagic fever into a world threat?
During Korean War, 1950s, we thought this disease is located only in the northern parts of South Korea, but now it exists all over the South Korea. And also same story goes to the China too, so that more than 100,000 cases of the hospitalized patient were reported.
But is the virus spreading or being uncovered by our own actions, like so many diseases?
There's evidence from Chinese medical literature that, in fact, the disease had been known in China as long ago as the 9th or 10th century. So the virus itself and the disease have been around for a very long time. What was new, therefore, was not the virus, not the disease, but the opportunity for people to become infected with this virus.
And we still provide that opportunity. In recent years, 12 young US servicemen and women have contracted the disease whilst on army maneuvers in Korea. 5 of them died. Churning up the ground created the right environment to cause this illness. So it takes more than the germ. It's many factors working together which produce an epidemic and make it spread. The Hantan family of viruses don't just exist in the countryside. Professor Lee made his second frightening discovery. Another strain, this time in house rats in downtown Seoul.
A janitor killed a house rat in his office and got the disease.
As you see here, how many house rats could be here? Because, you know, so many stores, food under the ground. So after that incident, we collected 14 house rats in this market and found half of them are seropositive and 4 of them had virus. So this virus, now we call it Seoul virus.
But the impact of this discovery is very important because house rat is all over the world and it goes by ship any place. So that if it is true, then we are facing a really big problem.
Which takes us right back to Baltimore, a port city on the US East Coast, where if we're not careful, we'll create for ourselves a new epidemic.
You got rats, they do that concrete. I seen some basements gutted out. I mean, things like that is in the basement. You know, it could easily be in the apartment. That's right. They threw the walls.
I know there are viruses here among these rats because we've isolated viruses related to Seoul from rats which we trapped in this alley. And we know through studying this alley for over 10 years that somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% of the adult rats which live in this alley are infected with Seoul virus. The people here are living very close with rats, and we know that they're getting infected because we can find antibody in the people who live in Baltimore. And yet still we don't see disease, or at least not much disease. And it's a mystery.
But we could discover the answer to the mystery too late. And if history is anything to go by, we'll have ourselves to blame.
Conditions could deteriorate, rat control could cease in our cities, and as rodents become more common, you could increase the probability of transmission to people.
There will always be new viruses waiting for the right circumstances to produce an illness which doctors will call a disease. And often, an important factor is loss of control. Losing control of the environment, as with Korean hemorrhagic fever, or even losing control of our lives, as with an illness which appeared about 80 years ago. War is an extreme example of the forces which can create disease. But many diseases are not infections. Many have lots of causes. And some diseases aren't even diseases. They're suffering reinforced by medical jargon, like shell shock in World War I.
If you create a disease, there'll always be those who rush to join it. You can, I think, consolidate an illness by rewarding it. It was thought that, well, when shells went off near you, they concussed your brain or your spine, and then you couldn't think or couldn't walk or whatever, so you should be taken away to a hospital and treated for the concussion of the brain or the spine. Now, that was largely a myth. In the First War, since shooting was the remedy for being afraid, I find it at least possible that some humane and reasonable people pushed the barrow of shell shock because the alternative was the firing squad, and that a medical diagnosis saved lives.
One young soldier wrote home about the horror around him.
I have had much luck and kept my nerve so far. The awful difficulty is keeping it. The bravest of all often loses it and becomes a gibbering maniac. The noise of our own guns, the enemy's shells, and getting lost in the darkness.
Sufferers from shell shock were rarely cured because the medical label invented a disease and its useless treatment.
If you look at the war pension figures after the First War, people who acquired a diagnosis of neurosis due to the war almost never got better.
Yet some did get better, but it was only after the doctors stopped treating shell shock as a medical problem. Instead of using hospitals, they worked in the battlefield, helping soldiers through the trauma. Although that lesson was easily forgotten. You see, you needn't have been in World War I to have suffered shell shock.
I'd go to sleep at night time and start talking in Vietnamese, screaming out, yelling out, punching and hitting in bed, come out in a lather of sweat.
You suffer from insomnia. I haven't slept any more than about 4 hours straight in one night in 20 years.
You always watch yourself in the crowd that someone's not going to come up and get behind you or something.
You go through 6 months and you think, well, yeah, things are okay. And then you might have a really bad patch where something might happen, something as simple as maybe a balloon bursting at a birthday party. And then you go back exactly where you started from.
You needn't have been in the battlefield to have suffered shell shock. In fact, you needn't have been in war at all.
Good evening, Kate Dunstan with Newsbreak. Police are still piecing together details of this afternoon's shocking shootout in a city credit cooperative. Ambulance services now put the death toll at 8 and the injured at 5.
When he first came home, he's very like a zombie. When he spoke, it was all in one tone, with no breaks, just like you'd expect a robot to speak. He had a really unusual smell about him, and I couldn't believe that. And I said, what's that dreadful smell? I asked someone being sick, and he said, no, it's fear. His personality changed completely. He went to work that morning, quite normal, and he came home that night quite different.
I thought that he had seen me and that he was then going to kill me. But he stopped at the desk that I was hiding under and he put some bullets on the top of the desk and started to reload his magazine. And it was then that I perhaps had some thoughts about whether I should try and jump out and grab the guy or something, but I was still firmly resolved that I wasn't going to move.
One trigger for this reaction is the ultimate loss of control, the feeling that you're about to die.
Nobody knows what it's like to die until you know you're going to die. And I was just quite positive I was. I said goodbye to the family. But as it was, I didn't, and that's something I'm sort of thankful for. The gunman then went on and shot about another 6 or 8 people.
He wasn't talking at all. He'd sit and sort of stare out the window or sit in the room and not bother turning lights on, things like that.
It's been something that has been on my mind to one degree or another, that if I'd have been able to do something, then those people wouldn't have been shot.
But it doesn't matter how many times I try to rewrite the script. The fact is, it happened, it's history. They are dead, I'm alive. These are the type of things that keep coming back whenever anyone says Vietnam.
It has only been the last 18 months that my family have wanted to know what I did over there and what sort of toll it had exacted upon me. There had been an armoured personnel carrier that was hit by an RPG, and it was evacuating nuns, and they were all killed, and we had to go down and extract the bodies from the carrier. And then 12 hours later, I was put on a Pan Am flight, 16 hours back in Australia, and they said, go enjoy yourself for 5 days, and consequently I was a chronic mess.
Well, eventually I ended up crashing. Psychologically, I probably couldn't handle it. Emotionally, I became numb. I couldn't show emotion to my wife or my children. And then my body started to react.
These reactions to Vietnam, World War I, or a mass murder are all the same. But the trouble with medical names for a psychological problem like shell shock is that we put the blame on the wrong things, like exploding shells or even a toxic chemical.
Well, I guess the penny dropped in 1978 when the American veterans in the United States started this class action against this Agent Orange. And we hadn't heard of the words Agent Orange up until then. As soon as you mention the word psychiatric, you're stuck with a stigma. We found it more comfortable, I guess, to wear the tag Agent Orange. And everything was sort of labelled under that Agent Orange.
We now recognise that trauma from a car crash to a shootout can cause a psychological reaction, not a disease. And today's medical label may be more therapeutic than shell shock. It's called post-traumatic stress disorder.
The DSM, that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, in other words, the Psych's Bible, had in it this new up-and-coming disease. It was called post-traumatic stress disorder. And in due course, my terminology on my Veteran Affairs files changed from personality disorder to post-traumatic stress disorder. And I weighed the two up together and I said, hang on, post-traumatic stress disorder, Agent Orange. So I thought, that's a little strange. I'm going to have to look up and see what the diagnosis is for both of these. Things like depression, anxiety, irritability, all the normal things associated with the Agent Orange was also the criteria set down for post-traumatic stress disorder.
I started going to the counselling service, and that's when somebody said to me, you have got what is called post-traumatic stress disorder. And I thought to myself, well, hell, you know, they've got a label for it.
At least with the name post-traumatic stress disorder, the focus is where it ought to be, on the trauma itself, and on helping people get it out of their system.
Being exposed to a little bit of literature on these sorts of traumas, I then realised that, well, yeah, perhaps I'm not quite as normal as I thought I was. When you then open yourself up to the help that you need, it obviously then becomes much easier to deal with those sorts of things.
I feel that if the system had been more perceptive and realised that there was going to be a lot of problems and had run debriefing programs, then maybe a lot of us wouldn't have suffered as badly as what I do.
As in World War I, the label was part of the problem. It may sound extraordinary, but a name can almost create a disease. And in Australia, in the early 80s, a name did help to create a disease. An epidemic, in fact.
No other country has suffered the kind of epidemic that appears to make RSI a uniquely Australian plague.
It may not be as lethal as AIDS, and it's rather more socially acceptable than VD, but it seems
RSI is so prevalent that the federal government has set up a special task force to look at the problem.
5,000 public servants have come down in pain since the epidemic started.
It swept through office blocks where computers had just been installed and affected thousands of people. Surgeons operated, physicians prescribed drugs, and millions of dollars were spent on a misleading diagnosis. And the epidemic worsened.
It was very confusing. People didn't even have a name for it initially. And then it was decided to call it repetitive strain injury. And I think that was really one of the first problems because it identified it as an injury without any evidence that there was an injury. I think one of the real problems was that we took a totally medical approach to it.
Strange as it may seem, abandoning the medical approach, stopping drugs and operations, had a surprising effect. It actually helped the Australian epidemic disappear. But by then, it had already spread. It has now shown up across the Pacific at the Los Angeles Times, where the lessons from Down Under seem to have gone unheeded.
If you've gotten carpal tunnel syndrome on the job, call the law office of Gary Gober, 320-55.
At Rubin Law Offices, we get money for injured people.
I've been hurt on the job. Can't work. I'm hurt. Can I see any doctor I want? What can I do?
It's in the marketing department, like circulation, and classified has some of it.
I'm in pain almost all the time. I don't want to be in pain almost all the time.
We look normal and we act normal. In fact, we're sort of cripples.
We call it coyote-itis because the manufacturer has dubbed this the coyote.
The names have been RSI, chronic tendonitis, carpal tunnel syndrome. Those are the names. The result is simply pain.
And it was almost as if they were catching the pain from the keyboards. Perhaps the Coyote computer was being wrongly blamed, just like Agent Orange after Vietnam.
What's it about?
It's about a detective.
It was a period following the introduction of our computers. I began to notice people in the newsroom with sore arms, sore wrists, sore necks.
And I felt what I thought was maybe that I had sprained my right wrist. And from there went to the doctor at work because so many other people at work had injuries to their hands.
This is a disease that affects just about every part of your life. When I go home, it's hard for me to cook. I can't garden out back. I just have a new son. It's hard for me to pick him up.
We've spent $1.5 million in editorial here and new equipment and workstations, and we're still seeing some cases.
The story at the Los Angeles Times could have been written in Sydney or Melbourne several years beforehand. But the Americans seem to have missed what the Australian experience could have taught them.
A Sydney psychiatrist who's caused a big stir in the RSI debate.
I think the medical profession has got to look at what it's doing and instead of applying a label, go back to its old skills of making an individual and precise diagnosis.
The more people talk about RSI, the more people discover they've got it.
I'm always on painkillers. I've got to sleep in these things.
I believe that the RSI disappeared from the Australian scene to a very large extent because we changed the name. We said this is not an injury. We did not accept that this was, that there was any evidence that this was an injury to muscles and tendons.
I'm going to do about 4 different scans of the elbow. Each one's going to be...
It's just been, you know, a medical cavalcade, you know. I've seen 9 or 10 or 11 different doctors between orthopedic surgeons and rheumatologists and an internist and a psychologist. I've taken a dozen different anti-inflammatory medicines. I've had cortisone shot into my wrist.
One of the best ways of looking at it is to consider one's belief systems. If you have a belief system on the one hand that says, look, I have a pain in the arm or a pain in the neck, I know that it's a thing called fatigue, I've got stresses at home or at work, but it's okay, it's a simple thing, it's going to go away once I've sorted those things out. In the second belief system, you have the same pain, and you believe that it's this condition called repetitive strain injury. In fact, if you keep working, you may never be able to work again. In one of them, it's a fatigue that you're still in control, you know what it is, and it'll settle down. They're the sort of aches and pains that we all get. The second one, you're dead scared.
It was absolutely baffling. We had no idea what was happening. We simply walked around in a state of puzzlement, wondering whether we were all a bunch of wimps. What had God done to the Los Angeles Times? We hired an ergonomics consultant. We had to develop a training film.
And I'm Audrey Chapman.
Studies of the misuse of video display terminals show consistent complaints of soreness and pain. Some ailments even require surgery to correct.
We're going to show you how to arrange your equipment so you achieve the ideal posture. A potential problem comes with pounding the keys on the keyboard. This action sends shockwaves up the arm.
Our original keyboard at the Times was a Coyote keyboard and was rather thick. And to use this keyboard, the patient had to keep their hands in an extended position. This extended position tires the lateral muscles or the extensor muscles of the forearm, and we call this extensor tendon overuse syndrome.
Okay. You want it on the nail or you want it on my... Just
right on the phalanx, yeah.
Right there.
Yeah.
People were trained to have this condition. You had unionists, other very well-meaning people coming into the workplace and telling people about this condition. I certainly saw posters that were put up in the workplace, again, with all good intention on an educational basis, but they had pictures of bolts of lightning with statements such as, if you have pain in your arms, stop work immediately. You could be permanently injured. These poor people sitting there at the keyboards, getting a bit of fatigue, looked up and saw this and thought, my God.
And the fatigue became pain, and the pain was called a disease, for which doctors struggled to find a cure.
Well, the primary thing we try to do is prevention. If that doesn't work, we go to ice packs and we do anti-inflammatory drugs. We use different kinds of splints. These splints put the wrists in a position of function. And there's also a thing called a tennis elbow clasp. Tennis elbow clasps are to protect the muscles on the lateral aspect of the forearm.
The idea that you should rest in splints was thrown out the window, that we took the approach that you need to actively rehabilitate these patients. If you put anybody in a splint or immobilise a joint, you may well get ongoing pain and swelling due to that immobilisation.
So, I mean, what I have here is just only the beginning. I have another pile at work of the kind of junk that I have. This is something to wrap around my arm when I'm in bed at night. It's an egg crate foam so that there's no pressure being put on me. This was one of the wrist splints I wore to hold my wrist in place during the time when they thought that was a good thing to be doing. And when I ultimately had surgery, this is the sling. It's all.
They just focused on his hands and his wrists. Instead of getting him to, first of all, understand what was going on and try to look at some of the stresses that were in his life, some of the psychosocial factors, which I suspect were probably quite significant.
In which country are we talking about, or is that an average across the different countries, or? My mother was a person who had chronic pain for 25 or 30 years, and so I have this, place in my mind that says, I don't want to be like my mother. And I never really believed that there's anything wrong with her, and I know that there's something wrong with me. The doctor, both before and after my surgery at different times, thought I should be doing exercises to strengthen my wrist muscles.
You've really got to reassure them right from the start that this is a simple problem, that it is going to go away eventually, that what you're going to be able to do is to get them to control the pain rather than the pain controlling them.
I'm still in pain.
I use a lot of simple things like Tai Chi or yoga, making sure that patients are doing proper relaxation, and then of course looking at the other stresses and strains in their life, but really trying to demedicalise things.
We had been on vacation for a week, and my arms, it's not that they didn't hurt, but I wasn't as conscious of it. It probably didn't hurt as much. And I came home last night and said, I found myself thinking as I drove home, why do I do this? Because doing my job makes my arms hurt. And I had a, distinct thing to compare it to.
Since the surgery really did so little to alleviate his pain, I think now our hopes are on someone just making the pain less, and ideally making the pain go away, and no longer wondering, what is it that's wrong?
So a sick workplace can be the breeding ground for a disease. And it's possible to imagine such a situation on a much greater scale, like a whole country which has lost control. Hungary was always the showpiece of the Eastern Bloc, with its Austro-Hungarian charm and sophistication. But all is not as rosy as it might look.
How
disease is the main killer of the Hungarian population. More than half of Hungarian people is dying in a heart attack. I'm director of the National Institute for Health Promotion. I have to face all challenges caused by the deterioration of the health status of the Hungarian population. I think I'm representing very well my population. Maybe I stopped to smoke, but it's better not to speak about my body mass index, and I have a mild hypertension. If you are looking for our statistics, we have the highest rate of suicide in the world. The tobacco per capita consumption is the third highest in the developed world. The cholesterol issue is quite unknown. Hard drugs are starting now in Hungary, but 1/10 of the Hungarian population is alcoholic.
So Hungary is a sick country, even though it looks deceptively beautiful. But if you're seeking solutions, hospitals and doctors aren't where to go. Ill health goes far beyond smoking and cholesterol. It's really about personal control and where disease really comes from. Hungary is emerging from 50 years of Nazi and communist rule, where the state decided what was important for everyone, and where you could be sure the new factory always won over health. But if communism was bad for health, democracy hasn't been too good either. Now they've swapped repression for uncertainty.
I think the impact of the changes in our countries on the health of the population is in historical long term, of course, an extremely positive one. But in short and medium term, we have to expect worsening prerequisites of health. Why? Because increasing poverty, deteriorating living standards, uncertainty, increasing inequities are things not too good for health.
If Hungary is one of the unhealthiest nations in Europe, and Hungarians amongst the most powerless, then like most countries, their working poor would be the sickest and most stressed of all. Mikhail Lokatos is a former truck driver.
Nem játék ez szakma. Elkezdtem izzadni, gyöngéltem, párat, és a mellem elkezd nyomni valami, és utána kész. És akkor bevittek a kórházba, és ott megállapítottak, hogy szívszorú messzesedés, gyanús vagy infarktus volt. Akkor már el akartak tiltani a munkától, de hogy még egy pár hónapig vagy évig dolgoztam még utána. Utána jött a másik, az vége volt teljesen, úgyhogy le is kellett kocsira szállni, már akkor már nem ment.
It's been a tough few decades for many Hungarians. Reduced life expectancy, poverty, low educational levels, and even a culture which has valued fatness as a sign of prosperity and good health.
Hát a doktor úr azt mondta, hogy hát tétázni kell, sok zöldet, kevés fűszert, és párizsit, krinolint. Ezt nehéz betartani, mert ezek a legdrágábbak.
The paradox for healthier eating habits is that the healthy choice is not the cheapest choice and not the easiest choice. Higher value meat, good vegetables, good fruits are expensive for an average Hungarian family. Well, the Hungarian kitchen is in your personality, in your way of thinking, in your lifestyle, in very early childhood. Pork fat, for instance, is the basis of the Hungarian kitchen. But the most cheap thing you can eat in Hungary is white bread with lard.
And there are more subtle influences on well-being than avoiding fat. Your standard of housing and the feeling that important decisions in life are outside your control make a healthy lifestyle one of the least important considerations in an otherwise stressful life, even if you're a director of health promotion.
In my professional life, I'm living in a high level of uncertainty. Since the last year of communist time, Each month, my minister is changing, the whole organizational framework is changing. Sometimes I don't know who is my chief, what's the legal framework. Well, at the beginning, I was really happy. I faced changes with pleasure, and now I'm more and more tired.
Even housing can affect your health, for example, by adding yet more uncertainty to your life. The Makaras have spent many years and much of their own money renovating their state-owned apartment. Now they must buy at the new market rate or stand to lose the lot. And the poorer you are, the worse it becomes. Why worry about diet when you haven't enough room to live?
Hát mi is öten vagyunk ebbe a kis lakásba. Hát bizony nem férünk el sokszor. A WC-re sorba kell állni. Úgyhogy reggel, mikor munkába indulnak, bizony sokat minden olyan szűk, hogy úgy kell menni, bujkálni. Én nem tudom, hogy kitalálta ki ezt a lakástervezést, hogy csinálták ezt. De én azt lakatnám itt benne élete végig.
Jó, köszönöm.
Csak az a baj, hogy régen lehetett jobban hozzájutni tanácsihoz. Most mindenki vegye meg készpénzért, vagy úgy oldja meg, ahogy tudja. Most már nem lehet lakáshoz másképp jutni.
Mi összespórolja a lakásra a pénzt, addig...
Hát addig mehet a temetőbe.
Hungarians aren't alone in their appalling health statistics. Bad health tends to occur wherever people lack power and lack choice. And Dr. Makara's tough job is to make Hungarians healthier. But he knows that pills or heart surgery aren't the answer.
I think coping is a main health issue in Hungary. If your life is hopeless, if you can't solve your conflicts, if you are living in poverty, if you have no control on everyday life situations, and you need some pleasure, the only way to get short-term oral pleasures is to drink. If you are drinking, you can forget work and also to find partners for communication, because communication is also very missing in Hungarian society. But it's very interesting in a former communist system. Skills for a collective, for a community life are totally missing. And that's why the individual is more weak facing this stressful situation, this process of changes, the wind of change.
Kerala, the most southern state in India, is a fascinating comparison with Hungary. Kerala also used to be communist. Kerala also has poverty, much worse in fact than Hungary's. And Kerala is also a place in transition. Yet its health statistics are amongst the best in the developing world. You see, there's yet another factor we've missed in this story of where disease comes from. And it's got to do with women.
I was married off at 15. When I was growing up, women had the feeling that with marriage, their body and their soul belonged to the man. Some years ago, I planned to make women more courageous. I chose certain characters as heroines in my stories. And you can see my heroines walking around on the road, working at offices. They're everywhere. They're in the court arguing out cases. They're in the hospitals looking after the patients, operating on them. You can see young women strutting around now, and they don't resemble the women I saw 20 years ago.
The confidence of these women may help to explain the good health of Keralans. Things like exercise and diet may play a part, but there's something more fundamental: the educational level of women. Education means knowledge, and knowledge means power to control one's life.
Among the girls, I was the first to earn in my family. My parents, they depended on agriculture for their livelihood, and so they sacrificed many of their desires and wants, and they educated us. So I was able to score high marks and I became first in the college. I think nearly 14 or 15 years I've been in boarding schools and hostels. So that has given me a real confidence, that's independence of my own.
We had women's education even 150 years back, I think, because the Maharajas of our place, they were very much interested in giving education to the people, especially women. They opened a lot of schools all over the country, and the advent of the Christian missionaries, that also helped. And I'll tell you another thing, the standard of health in this state is improving because the woman understands. And only if a woman understands what is happening, the society will improve.
If they can be educated properly, I think the care of the children will become much better. And here what we experience is that the mothers are very much aware of the fact that healthcare services must be utilized for the benefit of their children. I think that has played a major role in what we have attained. Low infant mortality, low birth rate, and low death rate.
കുട്ടികൾ ഇന്നത്തെ സാഹചര്യം അനുസരിച്ച് ഒരു കുടുംബത്തിൽ ഒന്നോ മൂന്നോ ആവാനേ പാടുള്ളൂ. അതിനപ്പുറം ആയിക്കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ അമ്മയ്ക്കും അച്ഛനും വളർത്തിയെടുക്കാനും ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുണ്ട്. അത് കാരണം കുട്ടികളുടെ ഉന്നത വിദ്യാഭ്യാസത്തിനും കുട്ടികളുടെ ആരോഗ്യത്തിനും എല്ലാ വിധത്തിലുള്ള നേട്ടങ്ങൾക്കും കുട്ടികളുടെ എണ്ണം കുറഞ്ഞിരിക്കണം. ഇപ്പം പിന്നെ കുട്ടികളെ നമുക്ക് എത്രത്തോളം പഠിപ്പിക്കാൻ കഴിയുമോ അതുപോലെ പഠിപ്പിക്കാനുള്ള സാഹചര്യത്തിന് വേണ്ടിയാണ് നമ്മൾ നിൽക്കുന്നത്. പൈസ ചിലവാകുന്നതിൽ ആർക്കും വിഷമവുമില്ല.
They are able to read and listen and understand at least part of what the world is trying to tell them. That makes their vision larger, I think.
But it's not all good news. The education system is also forcing change upon the country. More personal control means greater expectations.
I'm finding it difficult to get a job somewhere, good job, decent job anywhere now. The competition is very high.
But Jessie has found a temporary job as a research assistant looking at a surprising effect of Kerala's changing way of life. They're investigating coronary heart disease. Kerala is a society in transition, from developing to developed. And in that transition, they'll acquire the diseases of the West.
I think, there's a lot of stress and tension. We want to make lots and lots of money. We want lots of luxuries, and we think the only way to make money is through education. This is big business in Kerala now. But there is such a pressure from outside, The advertisements, the multinational companies. I think, when we are imitating the West in everything, we will imitate the harmful things also. We will try to accept, whatever the West accepts. I know heart disease is on the increase in Kerala now because of all these things. And I think, after some time, if we go on like this, we will lose everything that is precious. We have something different, something special, and I always feel this speciality is caused by the women of Kerala.
The women of Kerala have shown us some surprising influences on our well-being. But the last stop in our search for the origins of disease is the most basic influence of all, our genes, our heredity, which has hardly changed since the Stone Age, when humans first appeared. Which takes us to a remote corner of Australia, where a fascinating experiment has shown that we're designed for berries and lean meat, not burgers and chips. A change which has affected one group in Australia more than any other.
The Aboriginal people, in common with a number of populations around the world that are exposed to a very rapid westernisation in the 20th century, do develop very high rates of diabetes. Certainly there's no doubt that you need a genetic predisposition in order to get diabetes, and the Western lifestyle is obviously unmasking it.
Professor O'Day took a group of Aboriginal people with diabetes and high blood pressure back to more traditional hunting and gathering.
I was interested to go back to the Moanjum community, who I worked with a number of years ago on diabetes, and with whom I did the study on lifestyle change. In the space of a single person's lifetime, many of these people have made the transition from hunter-gatherer to modern Western man. And it may well be that this very rapid and extreme change may act as an even stronger trigger than a gradual change. Are the fish different in the wet season, or do you...
And the result of this remarkable bush experiment was that in less than 2 months, the Aboriginal people's illnesses began to disappear. And now others are learning from this experience.
Well, I stopped eating all this food from the shops, so I started eating the bush food, hunting, walking, just like I told some people that stop eating sugar, stop drinking alcoholic, so that the sugar won't affect them.
Aboriginal people were tall and healthy before Europeans destroyed their way of life. A way of life which was compatible with our Stone Age genes.
There was a very varied food intake. It's been described as feast and famine. This capacity to eat vast amounts and to select fat, sweet foods. They had to go out and get the food themselves. Now, that's a very powerful constraint on overeating. The irony is that the very food preferences which they had as hunter-gatherers are the ones which we're now trying to discourage. Very, very high consumption of sugar in tea and in sweetened drinks, and choosing fatty foods. It's now a case of constant abundance, and people become obese. It's one long feast, if you like, of inappropriate foods. So there's no longer the feast interspersed with famine. Now, most of the knowledge of the older practices is held by older people. I know every time I need to do a study out in the bush, I've got to have older people with me.
But we all have these Stone Age genes, which explains why diabetes is so common amongst elderly whites as well.
We tried to remodel the characteristics of the hunter-gatherer diet with a group of white elderly diabetics. When we're treating diabetes, we usually look at weight loss, or we look at diet, or we look at exercise. And really it's the three things together that were part and parcel of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle that were terribly important.
Lose weight, eat sensibly, get more exercise. These are common messages in today's world. And who would have thought it was Stone Age advice? But as we've seen in Kerala and Hungary, keeping our way of life in line with our genes isn't easy.
It's not practical to go back and live off the land long term, but we are trying to use this as a model which will be practical in the urban context.
Once again, our story comes back to the freedom to make important decisions about our lives. When these Aboriginal people are in an environment where they're in control, it pays off in better health.
They now have a very clear view that lifestyle and health are intimately related. And so I think in looking for solutions to some of the Western diseases that we have, it's quite instructive to go back to the hunter-gatherer diet and lifestyle for pointers as to where changes that we might make.
Understanding where disease comes from, this intricate relationship between our genes, the environment, our past, and even the way we think about ourselves, helps us gain more control over our well-being. But that's not a lesson which is easily learned, because since the Stone Age, it's been disease which has had the power to change the course of history.